All right, hi everybody. John Meadows here, and hugely controversial topic today. I don't know if it's controversial. Everybody wants to know how you should train if you're natural versus enhanced. And I think it's an excellent topic that probably should be discussed a lot more. So I've got a lot of ground I want to cover here. So let me just get started with something really basic. So the first question would be, would being enhanced actually help? And I don't think any of us have any doubts that extra PEDs help, but I want to show you a study or just a little bit of just cliff notes on a study that's going to really put this in perspective for you. It's from the New England Journal of Medicine, where they took 43 people and they had them train for 10 weeks, and they basically broke it up into 4 groups. They had a placebo group that did not exercise. They had a group that took test. To be more specific, they actually took 600 milligrams of test. And just to put that in perspective, usually a male produces 2.5 to 10 milligrams a day, and a woman about a quarter of that. So we call that super physiological. That's a lot of test. And exercised. And then they had a placebo group that was natural. They didn't know they were natural, but they took a placebo and they exercised. And then you had the group that took the real test and they exercised. So after this 10-week study, it was pretty interesting, because the people who didn't exercise and took a placebo, so they didn't take the test, they took what they thought maybe was test, they had no change in their muscle mass. The group that took test and did not exercise still gained 7 pounds of muscle. Now here's where it gets real interesting. The people who took the placebo, so they were still natural, and exercised, only gained 4 pounds. So think about that. These guys actually trained. The natural guys actually trained, and they gained 4 pounds of muscle, whereas these guys that took tests and didn't even exercise gained even more muscle. And then, of course, you have the guys that took the test, 600 milligrams, and they exercised, and they gained 13 pounds of muscle. I'm not saying that's going to happen with everybody, but it does point to the fact that if you're a natural, like, man, you got your work cut out for you. It's not going to be as easy for you. So you need to be very intelligent with your programming, okay? So I hope you can just see from that very simple example, you need to be real intelligent with your programming. How does this happen? What's happening at the cellular level when you take this testosterone? I'm going to keep this very, very basic, very simple. We have a cell membrane here, and inside the cell membrane, this area is called cytosol. And what you have in there is you have a nucleus. This is kind of in the center. And then you have these receptors in there that are very important. They're called androgen receptors. You hear people talk about androgen receptors. And just bear with me here. Looks like Pac-Man, right? So here's the androgen receptor. Now what happens is you get the PEDs going in the gear in particular, going through your blood, and it comes in here. It looks like we're just going to say it looks like a triangle. And then it attaches to this androgen receptor. All right. Now, when these experts, PED experts, talk about, different things to different receptors, that's not true. The androgen receptor, no matter what you're taking, it'll bind with the androgen receptor. There's other activities outside of that, but there's no Winstrol receptor. There's no testosterone receptor. Those things don't exist. So then that attaches here. Now, this little nucleus over here is pretty lonely. He's a lonely guy. So this new complex, this combination of the receptor and the actual chemical, they go over here and they attach to the nucleus. And some very, very profound changes take place. Just to put it simply, the number one change that takes place is muscle protein synthesis is really ramped up. And that's where your body's using amino acids to build protein. It's really ramped up. Now, typically what will happen when someone's natural is they'll train, and I've seen anywhere 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours, somewhere between 24 and 48 hours, protein synthesis is ramped up in that target muscle, and then it goes down. So what happens when people are taking, in that test case, it was 600 milligrams of testosterone, the protein synthesis is ramped up all the time, like literally all the time. So, whereas a natural person, the muscle protein synthesis and that trained muscle goes back down, there was some adaptations that took place But now if you don't train again, you lose those adaptations. So that's why people say the bro splits of only training a muscle once a week doesn't work for naturals. That's the science behind what they're saying. That's why they say that. And there actually is a lot of truth to that. Now, not only is muscle protein synthesis elevated from the changes that happen in the cell nucleus there, you can store more carbohydrates. There's a number of changes that happen, but that's the biggest change that happens. All right. Now, something else comes into play here. It's not as well defined as the muscle protein synthesis part of this, but you'll hear of a hormone called cortisol. Cortisol has receptors in there as well. And what happens with the PEDs, they will go in there and they'll actually kind of block cortisol from attaching to the cortisol receptor. Now, here's why that's important. So when you're training really hard, cortisol it's helping you produce energy. It's taking amino acids, it's using them as fuel. It's reducing inflammation. That's one of the things that cortisol does in your body. It's a good thing. But it's also something that creates muscle protein breakdown. So if you go to the very fundamental level of building muscle, you have this equation, muscle protein synthesis, which just think of it as just building muscle, and muscle protein breakdown. Just think of that as muscle being broken down. That very simple equation. So you need more muscle protein synthesis than you have muscle protein breakdown. Just mathematically, you need to have more to gain muscle. Now, if you're training and you're doing tons and tons of volume, especially the harder it is and the more volume you have, you're creating more muscle protein breakdown. And that's partially a result of all this cortisol that's being produced to support that training. You got to think about that if you're a natural. So you're going to produce a lot of muscle protein breakdown. That means your muscle protein synthesis is going to have to be really, really high. But we know after 24 to 48 hours, it's going to start dipping down. So if you've got these elevated levels of cortisol, you may be hurting your ability to gain muscle. Now, for the people who have PEDs, they're essentially blocking that cortisol receptor. Now, we don't know exactly how that happens, but it's a pretty strong theory. They can get away with a lot of real high intensity work, a lot of volume, because they don't have to deal with that excessive cortisol. And there's other ways we can deal with this nutritionally, and we'll get into that. Blocking cortisol is kind of not the end all be all. I'm going to give you some practical experience here. So back in the mid to late 90s, when this blocking cortisol became probably when it hit its peak in terms of that's how you really build muscle, we used this drug called cytidrin, aminoglutamide. And cytidrin essentially blocks cortisol. It's used to treat Cushing syndrome. So we used to take that. We used to think now we're going to explode. We're going to have no cortisol. And what happened was it actually didn't work at all. It just made you really tired. You got really sleepy. And it gave you a little bit of an anti-estrogenic effect. But so people kind of quit talking about blocking cortisol for a while because it didn't really work in that situation. But in the situation of a PD, there seems to be a lot of validity to this. Now, let me mention another thing about cortisol. So when you're blocking cortisol, your body has a response where it'll actually make more cortisol receptors, and your adrenal cortex will try to push out more cortisol. That's just an adaptation to those receptors being blocked. So think about what happens when you take something like testosterone. Your own levels decline because it's going to rely on the artificial supply. So then what happens is, let's say you come off the testosterone. Then what do you think happens? So then you have low testosterone, and until your own body kicks back in, hopefully it will. And now you're not blocking that cortisol receptor. So now you have this massive flood of cortisol. You have more receptors. And that's why you see the really big guys just literally shrink overnight. That's exactly what's happening. In fact, you can lose muscle so fast, you'll go take blood work and you'll see an elevation of enzymes that can freak doctors out. They think your kidneys are falling out just because some of the muscle enzymes that are measured in your blood work would indicate like this massive amount of damage. It's actually just muscle wasting away. So that's kind of some basic foundational stuff here that I wanted to show you. So now let's talk about practical. Like, what does this mean in the real world? So let's talk about your training intensity. A lot of people, I see these comments, and it's really sad People, anytime someone's training hard, somebody will say, well, he must be on gear. You can't train that hard if you're natural. That is the absolute worst attitude to have. If you're natural and you don't have all the advantages, you actually do need to train very intensely because it's harder for you to create the adaptation. You need to train really hard. You can't go in there and just goof off and do some pump sets and expect to get really big. You have to train hard. You have to do sets to failure. You have to do that. So the question becomes, it's more of a volume question. So we know you need to train intense. You probably need to take some sets to failure, but how many? How do you, as compared to somebody who's enhanced, what do you do? Well, my opinion is you're going to need less sets. The more of these high intense sets you do, the more at risk you are of all this excessive cortisol, which again increases muscle protein breakdown, which makes it even harder to be positive and have more muscle protein synthesis. And the other thing is, let's remember the very first thing we talked about, 24 to 48 hours, we'll just say 48 hours. Muscle protein synthesis has slowed down. So now if you don't do something pretty soon, you're going to lose those adaptations. So you have to train really hard and you're going to have to recover within 2 or 3 days. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to experiment. I can't tell you exactly how many sets you need to do. Here's what I would tell you. Try to take some sets, try to start off with doing, say, 3-4 sets to failure. So 3 or 4 exercises, only 1 set to failure. Actually, don't even do that. Pick 3 or 4 exercises and only take half of them to failure on the very last set. So let's say you do 3 exercises for your chest. On your first exercise, maybe don't take any of them to failure, but then on your second and third exercise, take your last set to failure. So really only 2 sets to failure. See how you feel. See how you recover. Let's say you recover fine. Next day you can't even tell you trained. Okay, now we're going to go back and we're going to take that first set, the first exercise, we're going to do a set to failure. So warm up, set to failure, complete failure. Second exercise, a set or 2 to get you going, boom, complete failure. Third exercise, a set or 2 to get you to the right weight, boom, failure. So three sets to failure. See how you feel from that. See, a lot of this is you're going to have a lot of people telling you exactly how many sets to do, but you're all very different. We all recover different. There's a lot of factors involved. So I want you to experiment, but I'm just giving you some guidelines. So start there. Just start with 1 set on each exercise to failure. And truthfully, for most people, that's enough. We do go through phases where we don't quite want to have the intensity. We want to maybe just not go nuts. So in that case, then we usually pick up the volume a little bit, just in a different phase of training. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you did that all the time, all this high volume training, then it's probably going to be harder for you as a natural to build muscle because, again, all the cortisol release and all that stuff. But anyway, so I want you to experiment. Don't let people tell you what you can and can't do. If someone says, oh, you can't train hard if you're natural, that's total BS. Total BS. When I was in high school, in my early years of college, I was training at failure. I was on a lot of failure sets. I was over squatting 500 naturally. I was working my butt off natural for many, many, many years. So you're going to have to play around with your volume. It's probably going to have to be on the low end, but I want you to think about is I need to hit the muscle, let's just say twice a week, so I need it to recover. So if you do those high intensity sets, we'll say 2 or 3 of them, and you can't recover, then back off a little. Get it to where you can recover every, so you can hit the muscle twice, okay? You don't need, a lot. I think one of the popular things now, I think it's a fad personally, is just training everything every day. But if you truly understand what intensity is and going to failure and sometimes going beyond failure, it's going to be really hard for you to do a set of failure on your biceps, your triceps, your chest, your shoulders, your back, your quads, your hams. People that are doing that most likely are not really using the kind of intensity I'm talking about. And maybe they are, but they're not doing it every single day. There's just no way. So for naturals, I know it's the in thing right now to do total body training. I just personally don't think it's the optimal way to gain muscle. I'm not saying you can't gain muscle. I'm just saying it's maybe not the most optimal way to gain muscle as you get through intermediate and advanced. If you're a beginner, sure, train your whole body every day, do whatever, because you probably don't have that much intensity. But as you get intermediate and advanced as a natural, and remember, as a natural, you're going to probably in 3 to 5 years of hard training, you'll hit your peak. So if you're natural and you've been training 2, 3, 4 years, you're probably not going to grow for 15 more years. You probably got a couple years of growth left. So volume, manage your volume so you can recover and hit the muscle twice. I'm just going to use that as your general guideline. Okay. Intensity. Don't believe the hype that you can, as a natural, train really hard. You still need those intensity sets. I want to talk about the nutrition part a little bit too. A lot of people see my intro workout nutrition strategy, and if you're not familiar with it, I'm just a big believer in essential amino acids and specific carbohydrates while you train. It's called cluster dextrin, branch cyclic dextrin to be specific. What happens when you use the cluster dextrin, those carbohydrates also can kind of calm down, especially when it's combined with amino acids, those two together can kind of calm down that cortisol response. We've seen that in studies, and they also measure something called 3-methylhistidine, which is a marker of muscle protein breakdown. It's also greatly reduced with an intra-workout protocol. There's not a lot of science out there on intra-workout protocols, but that's one thing I feel very passionately about because I've seen it work with probably, honestly, thousands of people over the last 10 years. So that is a way for naturals to really, really help manage cortisol, manage muscle protein breakdown. It's consuming aminos. It's consuming that cluster dextrin while you train. A lot of guys will say, well, you had your steak that day. The aminos are still in your bloodstream, and you had your baked potato or whatever. That's true, but anyone who's ever tried this will tell you that you notice, man, I'm not nearly as sore. I feel a lot more fresh. Sometimes even their joints feel better. So I would say nutritionally, an intra-workout strategy is very important, especially for people who are natural. A lot of people think of it as differently. They think, well, an enhanced person, they're doing all this volume, they're doing all this high intensity, so they need more nutritionally, and that is true. So it actually helps both groups. So that's a nutritional part of this I wanted to mention. And then just in terms of food, the guys who are enhanced, their bodies are much more efficient at handling protein and nutrition. It just can handle more. They can feed constant protein every 3 hours and 30, 40, 50 grams every single meal. And their body, you remember the very first thing I showed, that at the cellular level is really good at turning up and cranking muscle protein synthesis. Whereas, remember, a natural isn't quite that efficient. They don't have that constant crank going on in muscle protein synthesis. So you may not be able to take as much protein. So as a natural, I tend to have people around 1 gram per pound of body weight, maybe slightly more if they're dieting. I do think in general people overeat protein. I think they probably eat too much. They don't really need as much as they eat. My people who are enhanced, maybe 1.25 grams per pound. I mean, I think if you're in that ballpark. But I would say nutritionally, your body's not quite as good at using protein naturally as the guys who are enhanced. And the other thing is, when you're trying to gain muscle, I see a lot of guys who are enhanced will add a lot of calories. Like, I'm going to go from 3,000 calories to 5,000. And honestly, some of them can get away with it to a large degree. But if you try that as a natural, you're just going to gain a lot of fat. You're going to gain fat really quick. You got to be more careful about the caloric increases that you put into your plan. Maybe you only need 300 calories or 400 calories. Maybe you only need 250 calories. So you got to be a little bit more methodical. One of the things about dieting when you're natural is it's very easy to lose muscle. So think about this logically. If you put on a ton of fat, think about how hard you're going to have to work to get that fat off. And you're already at risk of losing muscle because you're in a caloric deficit for so long. And to build on what we were talking about earlier, if you're in a caloric deficit, just by nature of that, you normally have higher cortisol levels and stress levels. And I'm sure those of you who have dieted hard can know exactly what I'm talking about, how that feels. So now you've got to do an even longer diet. I know a lot of guys say, well, natural people need to be on long diets. I don't know that I agree with that. I mean, think about it. If you're natural, if you're dieting for a long time, it's more cortisol, it's more stress. So I'm not saying that long diet approach doesn't work. I'm just saying think about it. Just be careful with that approach. So those are some things to think about with your training, with your diet, just some good understanding around what's going on. Another thing I would say is that the type of exercise selection it's a consideration. You get guys that are enhanced and their muscles get strong really fast, and sometimes their connective tissue can't keep up and they get injured, they tear things. Whereas the natural, you don't quite have that risk. You're not gaining strength so fast that you're at that risk. So you can get away with a little bit more compound movements than a guy like, that's been cranking gear for a long time. He's got to be real careful that he doesn't pop something. And I've seen more pec tears from my enhanced friends than you can even count. I can't even count how many I've seen pec tears specifically from compound movements, heavy benches. So that's another consideration. Anyways, I hope this video helps. I want you to understand that when people are telling you have to do X and Y, I don't agree with that. I want you, if what you get out of this, I hope that what you get out of this is you need to experiment. And I hope what you're thinking is, as a natural, I need my muscles to recover in 2 to 3 days, but I need some high intensity sets. So I've got to figure out how I can train really hard, how much of that I can do and still recover. When you find that out, that's going to give you the key to growing as fast as you can. Also, an intra-workout nutrition approach will help, provided your calories are good.